Welcome to another episode of The Dissection. Donald Trump has issued an executive order that sanctions South Africa. Sanctions, broadly defined, mean restrictions limiting the freedom of a state, a group, or individuals, which are imposed through a unilateral decision by a state or collective decision by several states. It's a form of reprimand, and this particular executive order has the effect of reprimanding publicly South Africa by the United States of America and withdrawing some access that South Africa has been enjoying of American funding. So if you're wondering what is an executive order is a signed written directive from the President of the United States that manages operations of federal government. It is one of the means by which a president exercises executive power as granted in Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. Executive orders have the force and effect of law, but they do not require approval from Congress to be implemented. They are used to direct actions within executive branch agencies and can affect legal rights and responsibilities, though they are not legislation themselves. As I've stated, the authority comes from Article 2 of the Constitution or delegated powers from Congress. Their legality is such that they can be reviewed by courts for constitutionality. Their enforceability, they have similar enforceability as federal law, and their reversibility is such that an executive order can only be overturned by another executive order issued by a sitting president. So the action that has been taken by Donald Trump to issue this executive order, which was issued on the 7th of February, 2025, is one that shows that the USA has taken a hostile position to South Africa. They want to punish South Africa, and this also may have a bearing on South Africa's access to the preferential markets through AGOA, which is USA's preferential free trade access agreement. AGOA is something that is going to come up, and it can only be revoked by Congress as it is a piece of legislation. But these moves by the Republicans indicate that AGOA may indeed be significantly at risk when it gets reviewed. So here's what you need to know about AGOA. South Africa is a beneficiary of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is a United States trade act. As a nation, South Africa exports a significant amount to the United States of America. The USA is the second largest export destination, second to China. According to the South African Revenue Services, the USA received 7.8% of South African exports in 2022. According to the US Department of Commerce, the value of exports from the US to South Africa in 2022 was 6.5 billion or 130 billion rands, and the value of imports from South Africa to the USA was over double that amount at $14.6 billion or 280 billion rands. So there's a trade surplus in favor of South Africa of 150 billion rands. The balance of trade is in favor of South Africa. Qualification for AGOA, this preferential trade deal, is based on a set of conditions which are in the AGOA legislation. In order to qualify and remain eligible for AGOA, an AGOA beneficiary country must demonstrate respect for rule of law, human rights, and core labor standards. An important provision to be aware of is that beneficiary countries should not seek to undermine U.S. foreign policy interests. So by being able to sell your goods to American markets, you have to then align with U.S. foreign policy interests. They've typically been willing to overlook small, violations of their interests by African nations, etc., who undermine U.S. foreign policy interests or challenge U.S. foreign policy interests. But it looks as if under Donald Trump, they're not willing to necessarily keep that same turning a blind eye to certain activities. AGOA includes a statutory requirement for annual reviews to examine the compliance of each participating country with the Act's eligibility criteria. And what you need to be aware of is that the U.S. Congress has actually initiated a review of South Africa's inclusion into AGOA. Last year, South Africa secured its African Growth and Opportunity Act benefits for another year, allowing duty-free access into US markets in 2025. But the question then becomes, will that be renewed for 2026? As things go right now, this executive order by Donald Trump indicates that the prospects of AGOA continuing into 2026 may not be very high, and this could have a damaging impact on the South African economy, damaging impact also on the rand as a currency. So let's look at what the Trump executive order actually says. So it's actually titled Addressing Egregious Actions of the Republic of South Africa, February 7, 2025. By the authority invested in me as president by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, it is hereby ordered as follows. Section 1. Purpose. In shocking disregard of its citizens' rights, the Republic of South Africa recently enacted Expropriation Act 13 of 2024 to enable the government of South Africa to seize ethnic minority Afrikaners' agricultural property without compensation. This act follows countless government policies designed to dismantle equal opportunity in employment, education, and business, and hateful rhetoric and government actions fueling disproportionate violence against racially disfavored landowners. In addition, South Africa has taken aggressive positions towards the United States and its allies, including accusing Israel, not Hamas, of genocide in the International Criminal Court of Justice and reinvigorating its relations with Iran to develop commercial, military, and nuclear arrangements. The United States cannot support the government of South Africa's commission of rights violations in its country or its undermining of United States foreign policy, which poses national security threats to our nation, our allies, our African partners, and our interests. Section 2. Policy. It is the policy of the United States that as long as South Africa continues these unjust and immoral practices that harm our nation, A, the United States shall not provide aid or assistance to South Africa, and B, the United States shall promote the resettlement of Afrikaner refugees escaping government-sponsored race-based discrimination, including racially discriminatory property confiscation. Section 3. Assistant. All executive departments and agencies, including the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, shall, to the maximum extent allowed by law, halt foreign aid or assistance delivered or provided to South Africa, and shall promptly exercise all available authorities and discretion to halt such aid and or assistance. The head of each agency may permit provision of any such foreign aid or assistance that, in the discretion of the relevant agency head, is necessary or appropriate. Section 4. Refugee resettlement and other humanitarian consideration. The Secretary of State and Secretary of Homeland Security shall take appropriate steps consistent with law to prioritize humanitarian relief, including admission, resettlement through the United States Refugee Admissions Program for Afrikaners in South Africa who are victims of unjust racial discrimination. Such a plan shall be submitted to the President through the Assistant to the President and Homeland Security Advisor. That's the long and short of this executive order from Donald Trump. So let's address some of the things here. The purpose of the order, to be quite honest, seems to be based on misinformation and narratives that the Republicans have been given by organizations such as AfriForum, by individuals such as Elon Musk. It seems as if that the right wing has a particular understanding of South African politics, which is not genuine. So let's look at some of the elements of the stated purpose of this, right? So, in shocking disregards of its citizens' rights, South Africa has recently enacted Expropriation Act 13 of 2024 to enable the government of South Africa to seize ethnic minority Afrikaners' agricultural property without compensation. The Expropriation Act is not a manifestation of how the EFF has argued for land expropriation without compensation, which is that mines and farms should be nationalized, basically. It is a very narrow act which outlines that there are 4 different ways in which land may be expropriated for no compensation, just 4, right? Number one, where that land has been left undeveloped for a long period of time and the owner is holding on to it for speculative reason. This sometimes happens when you have areas of high commercial, development, such as, Cape Town, CBD, and Johannesburg, in some of the areas where the value, like Rosebank, is going up, the value of the property, and the owner is just leaving this plot of land undeveloped because he wants it to keep multiplying in price, but it cannot be used for anything, affordable housing or anything to that effect. So the law envisions that under those conditions, that land may be available for null compensation. The other scenario is where the property owner has failed to exercise reasonable control of the property that they own. And this applies to abandoned buildings, such as buildings in the CBD of Johannesburg, where these buildings have been hijacked. And this topic has been the subject of movies and all manner of discussion, where people have hijacked buildings. These gangsters basically then collect rents, etc., mismanage the buildings. Those buildings get dilapidated. That's scenario number two. Number three is where that land is already owned by an organ of the state, but that organ of the state is either not using all of the land or the purpose has now changed. This may apply to the Ingonyama Trust, where you see in KwaZulu-Natal, the king actually oversees 30% of the land in KwaZulu-Natal under the Ingonyama Trust, a deal that was made with de Klerk and Mangosuthu Buthelezi on the eve of South African elections in 1994, and then was upheld after the fact by the ANC government because they didn't want to start any trouble with the king and to lose KZN. So that's another situation. And then number four, where the state has already invested more than the market value of the land. That is all that the Act says. And it's a clear system. There's going to be an investigation, there's going to be a notice of intention, and then there's going to be a notice of expropriation, and then there's going to be a determination of the value. If at any of those stages someone feels that their land should not necessarily be expropriated, they can go to the courts and make a case. But other countries have versions of laws which allow for expropriation of land with compensation. And those are, like in America, they've got the eminent domain, which allows them to build bridges, etc., etc. This law that Ramaphosa passed is almost identical to eminent domain. All it does is it says that typically in Section 12, there will be compensation at market value. But there will also be just and equitable compensation where there are considerations around the acquisition of that land, etc. Not all land in South Africa was just bought on the market fairly. A lot of land was dispossessed from South Africans unjustly, unfairly, through first and foremost the Glenn Gray Act, secondly the Native Land Act, then also through the Group Areas Act, where just because you were black, you're pushed to the periphery of the country, pushed to unfertile land, and then commercial farming land, urban land was then given to people of particular races to the exclusion of others. So the land acquisition in South Africa is not something that happened under a free market in the last 100 years or so. No, it actually happened that between 1913 up until now, a lot of the land that was acquired and developed was done so unjustly. It's not true that the land in South Africa was just empty and then, Afrikaners arrived and took over the land and it was empty. It was just the sun in a corner of South Africa. The Mapungubwe were here for thousands of years, right? The Xhosa communities, there are traces, archaeological traces. If you look into that, you can see that. So showing that they were present for thousands of years in this particular region, over 1,000 years for sure. So the Zulus, the Xhosas, the Vendas have been living in South Africa for over 1,000 years. Jan van Riebeeck arrived in 1652. So it was not empty. The land was occupied. The land was violently dispossessed from its rightful owners. So it's not true that this is a morally unjust action that the South African government is taking. It's simply not true. What it then says is that the act allows countless government policies designed to dismantle equal opportunity in employment, education, and business. Let's talk about affirmative action quickly. In, I think 1953, the Bantu Education Act was passed. Is it 53 or 51? Somewhere around there. The Bantu Education Act was a law designed to provide inferior education for Black people in South Africa by the apartheid regime. That was the design of the law. They were supposed to get worse teachers. Their curriculum was limited. The idea that when you then, in post-democratic South Africa, try to balance and reverse the consequences of those laws, because what happens is that you have companies, you have industries, and you have universities which are saying, okay, we take from these schools, we are basically taking one racial group. There has to then be like, no, you can't do that anymore, because you need to give opportunity to other racial groups which were deliberately disadvantaged, right? So let's say it's like a scenario where one group of people was being told to run a marathon carrying 50 kgs on their back, and the other group was being told to run the same marathon with no encumbrance. When 1994 happened, what then happened is that people were told, put down the 50 kg, run fairly, but also, we're going to make sure that you are allowed to enter this competition and run. It's not unfair to do that. It's a correction of unfairness. It's a correction of the consequences of the apartheid legacies. You cannot say that when somebody has been stabbed in the back, that them going to the doctor to request the doctor at the trauma unit to remove that wound and actually to be treated is reverse discrimination. It's not. You also can't say that when somebody has, been controlling access to the river, right, for drinking water for 100 years, when eventually the system changes and everyone is given access to the river, that person can say, no, but I've been drinking this water alone for the last 30 years. Why are you guys now discriminating against me? Fairness and equality are actually what affirmative action policies in South Africa sought to achieve. Now, there's the BEE laws, which were used by ANC comrades to get shares of big companies, not to the benefit of the majority of people. That is one thing that we can have robust conversations about, because Patrice Motsepe, Cyril Ramaphosa, several other people benefited from BEE laws. They became board directors, they got shares of companies, but that didn't necessarily translate to wealth and prosperity for people on the ground. There's a conversation about the implementation of BEE, but BEE is not the only affirmative action policy that was implemented. So I think that I've said a lot, but what should be clear is that the purpose of this executive order seems to be driven by an incomplete understanding of the purposes for affirmative action policies in South Africa, and an incorrect description of what those policies impact is on the ground, because to implement fairness is not unfairness in and of itself. If we're running a marathon and I've been forced at gunpoint to run with 50 kgs on my back, and you're running with the latest Nike sneakers provided for you by the government, because remember, a lot of the Afrikaner public schools were actually government funded. The whole school this, the whole school that, these high schools, they were funded by the government. And the differential funding was that I think it was ×5 what the black schools were receiving, right? And then those schools then became former Model Cs. So you were running with the latest Nike sneaker that Eliud Kipchoge wears, and you were at the start line together. Someone comes and says, no, why is Jamie being forced to run barefoot with 50 kgs on his back? Let him run without that encumbrance. You, the guy who was training at the elite facility, can't then say, no, that's unfair. It's not unfair. It's fair, right? So there's something that we need to look at here. AfriForum actually has been calling for sanctions, and this seems as if it's some granting of their request, right? Part of the concern that AfriForum has is that a lot of farmers export to America, and they are worried that if AGOA is cancelled, Trump cannot cancel AGOA unilaterally. It has to go through Congress, but they are worried that if AGOA is cancelled, then those farmers will lose benefits. So it looks as if this is where they are happy to stop, but I don't think, and also they want individual sanctions on ANC leaders, and they may get them, right? But I don't think that they will be able to stop all of the developments here, because it looks as if America is willing to play hardball. And even if you look at the comments that were made by potentially the incoming ambassador, they want to play hardball. They want to freeze and reverse the Expropriation Act. And really, it's a challenging situation. So one of the questions that arises from this conversation is, the question of the refugee status, because this act says that, Afrikaners will be able to get refugee status in America if they are discriminated against by this act. And it presumes, of course, that they are. And we've seen a conversation where Elon Musk has been saying that immigrants do contribute and they can contribute. And I think Vivek Ramaswamy came in and started speaking about getting Indians. Then he was removed. And then now it looks as if the people that they're going to try to get are Afrikaner white South Africans to come into America. So on AfriForum front, that could be a victory because there could be some people wanting to go to America, willing to say, I've been discriminated against, they want my farm, etc., etc. Those people will be able to get refugee status. So some people have said, but, this Section 4, which says that the Secretary of State and Secretary of Homeland Security shall take appropriate steps consistent with law to prioritize humanitarian relief, including admission and resettlement through the United States Refugee Admissions Program for Afrikaners in South Africa, is actually not going to work because on the 20th of January, Trump passed a different executive order suspending the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. So the question is how can that work now? Will they actually get a benefit because the Refugee Admissions Program has been suspended? The answer is not quite. They will be able to go to America and get refugee status because of the following. I'm going to read certain sections of the 20 January executive order. So the executive order from the 20th of January is called Realigning the United States Refugee Admissions Program, right? And it suspends the program. So what was said here is the following. Over the last 4 years, the United States has been inundated with record levels of migration, including through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. The United States lacks the ability to absorb large numbers of migrants, in particular refugees, into its communities in a manner that does not compromise the availability of resources for Americans, that protects their safety and security, and that ensures appropriate assimilation of refugees. This order suspends the U.S. refugee admissions programs until such a time as the further entry into the United States of refugees aligns with the interests of the United States. So that's Section 1, right? Section 2, which says the following. It is the policy of the United States to ensure that public safety and national security are paramount considerations in the admission of the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, and to admit only those refugees who can fully and appropriately assimilate into the United States, and to ensure that the United States preserves taxpayer resources for its citizens. It's also the policy of the United States that to the extent permitted by law and as practicable, state and local jurisdictions be granted a role in the process of determining the placement or settlement in their jurisdictions of aliens eligible to be admitted into the United States as refugees. Then what it says now in terms of what's going to happen, realignment of the program. A, Trump says, I hereby proclaim that entry into the United States of refugees under the admissions program would be detrimental to the interests of the United States. I therefore direct that entry into the United States of refugees under the program be suspended, subject to the exceptions set forth in subsection C of this section, until a finding is made in accordance with Section 4 of this order. This suspension shall take effect on January 27, 2025. Here's what he then says as exceptions in Section C. Section 3, Section C. Notwithstanding the suspension of the refugee program imposed pursuant to subsections A and B of this section, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Homeland Security may jointly determine to admit aliens to the United States as refugees on a case-by-case basis in their discretion, but only so long as they determine that the entry of such aliens as refugees is in the national interest and does not pose a threat to the security or welfare of the United States. Then it says, within 90 days of this order, the Secretary of Homeland Security, in consultation with the Secretary of State, shall submit a report to the President through the Homeland Security Advisor regarding whether the resumption of entry of refugees into the United States under the refugee program would be in the interest of the United States. So, will Afrikaners be able to go under the refugee program? It's clear that they will still be able to go because, first and foremost, the executive order, the first one that I read, the one suspending the funding, is one that specifically carves out an exception. for Afrikaners coming from South Africa. And it does allow the Secretary of State, it does allow the Secretary of Homeland Security to create this exception. So some people have speculated that no, they won't be able to come in because of that, but that's incorrect. They probably will still be able to come in, and they will likely get refugee status into America as a result of this. And I'm sure some people have wanted to go to America, will use this particular moment in time to go to America. And that's what's happening. So long term, it seems as if this is just the beginning of this fight between South Africa and the United States of America. And in fact, Trump also issued an executive order that sanctioned the ICC. And that's something that I think will continue to be a discussion in and of itself. So I think this is the beginning. Sanctions have got levels. And one of the things that they can start at this level, right? Because what the thing actually says that they can make an exemption for policies such as US aid, which cover the provision of ARVs, antiretrovirals. So it may very well be that the impact of this is very small in the sense of what is the financial weight on South Africa. But the symbolic impact could be bigger, because what Donald Trump is showing the world is that I don't like South Africa. I don't like how they've been treating our friends on the international stage. I don't like how they've been treating America. And he then could see how South Africa responds, escalate. See how South Africa responds, escalate. See how South Africa responds, escalate. And remember, South Africa has been grey listed. Remember, the rating agencies that rate South Africa are American rating agencies. And historically, rating agencies were used for internal politics to say, no, the rating must go down, then we'll march against Zuma, etc., etc. They've been relatively stable under the Ramaphosa administration, and in fact, improved a little bit. But Americans can intimidate those same rating agencies to downgrade South Africa. And that would trigger a lot of financial consequences for South Africa, which people within the financial sector don't want, which is why you see the DA now trying to plead with the Americans. People in the farming sector, also commercial farming, may not want, which is why you also see John Steenhuisen as Minister of Agriculture scampering. People are even joking now that he's an ANC guy. So these things could end up happening. So this is a very serious moment. It looks as if Trump has picked South Africa as one of his targets and is willing to keep going. The thing about a bully, right, is because, President Ramaphosa in the State of the Nation said, no, we won't be bullied. And he made reference to that. The thing about a bully is that if he's challenged on the playground by you, you have to be prepared to fight him, because he's not going to allow you to speak against him and do nothing. He's going to come now because you've called him out, right? You want to have the fight with him. So they're going to come. And this is not a situation where we are dealing with a weak guy who doesn't want to be. America is a very powerful country. Elon Musk is very powerful. We saw Silicon Valley CEOs marching to bend the knee, basically. So Trump is in a position right now where he's at the peak of his powers. And President Ramaphosa is not actually at the peak of his authority, even within the ANC, despite the show of force at the State of the Nation, because he's going into, an elective conference where new leadership will be elected, not now in 2025, but in 2027. But that is happening, right? And 2027 is still going to be within Donald Trump's administration, by the way. So he's fighting Trump going towards the end of his time while Trump is coming in. And the rhetoric needs to be very careful, because these things do affect ordinary people. One of the things that I want to say is I don't think that America is justified in this particular executive action. I do think that they are committed to this escalation over time. And this looks as if it's just the opening blows in round one. Elon Musk is invested in this. Joel Pollak seems to be invested in this. And these people have the ear of the President of the United States of America. AfriForum has been touring the world, with their book and informing people in ways that were disparaging, I think, towards South Africa. They say that, no, we didn't say that, we didn't do that. But I don't think that everything that they said was glowing, right? So, and I say that within my journalistic opinion. So, and I have to say that for legal reasons. So, because AfriForum loves to sue people. So, in all of that, I do think that we are in a moment now where there are potential economic consequences, potential consequences. And remember, there's gray listing. Did I mention gray listing? That could shift also. That's a tool that America can use, right, to pressure South Africa, because the president, he did have foreign currency, US dollars in his SOFA that have not yet been fully accounted for. The Americans could start looking into that on Fox News, etc., and exacerbating that to say this guy. And then remember, Marco Rubio was talking about relationships with Zimbabwe and ZANU-PF. All of these things can be then brought up at a later stage to even, tighten the noose, so to speak, on the economy of South Africa. So this is a significant moment. It's not a trivial moment. And now we have to really think about how to navigate this moment. As things stand right now, I don't think that the public confrontations are working with Elon Musk. I think that everything must now be done with Elon Musk, with Cyril Ramaphosa. Everything must be done behind the scenes. They must really work behind the scenes, because if they escalate this, Trump loves to perform for the public. So if they escalate this on the South African side, he will escalate. He will escalate. But South Africa is it's a middle income economy, right? Parts of it are very developed, but parts of it still need lots of resources. The president was speaking in the State of the Nation about, funding that is coming, for the renewable energy, etc., etc. If the world sees that it's not worth backing South Africa on certain things, because then you get into a fight with Trump more directly, they may walk away. And as much as Europe and France and all of these countries have been provocative towards Trump and challenging him, they may not be willing to fight on South Africa's behalf at this particular point. So this means that everyone has to be very cautious on this particular issue. I don't know how you bring back the correct information at this point, because it basically would need Fox News, One American News Network, Breitbart to actually say that there isn't unfair discrimination of white South Africans in South Africa. I don't think that they're going to say that. So if CNN says it, Trump is still not going to believe it. If it's just even fact checks and whatever they call community notes are not going to slow the momentum. They seem to be committed to be on this bus. I don't know. What do you think about this moment? I think it's a moment. It's a developing story. We'll all have to follow it. But what do you think? What's your view? Let's have a conversation. Till the next one.